Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal and the host of Opinion Journal each day at WSJ Live, joins me. Mary, again, we are moving through a news cycle that is relentless, and I've watched your presentations this last week, and they are dominated by Iran, by foreign policy, by the threat, and the mysteries of what was announced a week ago in Vienna and what the president continues to present to the American people. It's now before the Congress. Mary, the lifting here is very heavy. What is your measure of the public? Is it listening keenly?
I think so, John. Measuring from the outrage in Congress, it seems like the more that we look at the fine print of this deal, the more disturbing it becomes. As you said, just in these last days, we've found that the administration is lifting sanctions on a man who has killed hundreds of Americans in Soleimani, the Iranian general, but also on nuclear scientists that Iran needs to make a weapon, also on a known nuclear proliferator. And then, of course, there are the side deals that we've just found out about, thanks to the work of Senator Tom Cotton and Representative Mike Pompeo. And it all culminated today in this hearing in front of a Senate committee that was, shall we say, illuminating. Illuminating,
yes. We'll come to the Anytime, Anywhere, but we need to investigate something that I learned for the first time, an interpretation of what we know of the Vienna deal. And we welcome our guests, Scooter Libby, and Hillel Fradkin, both of the Hudson Institute, in an op-ed published in the Wall Street Journal. I recommend it to all of you because it takes this number, 24 days, which is itself a challenge to logic, 24 days for doubts to be translated into inspection regimens inside Iran. It takes that number and lays out what we're actually dealing with, what has been promised, guaranteed, what Congress is being asked to vouchsafe, as the United Nations Security Council did at the beginning of this week. Hillel and Scooter, a very good evening to you. I begin with you, Hillel. 24 days, that's a number that the president has spoken of carefully to get access to sites where there may be a deception. What does that 24 days represent, and what could it become? Good evening to you, Hillel.
Good evening, and thanks very much for having me. Well, I think one has to... one thing to observe about the way in which this agreement is structured is that the 24 days has to do with the IAEA, which has established principles for investigating questions of nuclear proliferation. And it has been dealing with Iran in that fashion for a number of years without any satisfaction. What the process has been up until now is what is called managed access. Managed means IAEA goes and asks a question about some site, and then the Iranians are supposed to respond, or some other party to the treaty. In the case of the Iranians, in the case of this, there's really not a very well established procedure for how access will be acquired. And in fact, the IAEA has not been able to get access to the sites that it's addressed questions about. What the 24 days does is ostensibly put into place a mechanism by which its questions will be answered. But the problem is that, and if it were that, it would be, as you say, a little bit on the questionable side. But still, there would be a clear process by which questions were posed and answered, and some decision or a determination was achieved. Instead of just leaving it at that, what the agreement does is combine it with the pre-existing character of managed access. What precedes the 24 days is a period in which the IAEA is supposed to go about its business the way it did before, asking questions, and then a period in which the Iranians are supposed to provide explanations. If the explanations aren't satisfactory, they keep going until they reach the 24 days. So that period beforehand can be several weeks, maybe even months. After the 24 days, one goes through the 24 days, there's another period after which, assuming that the questions aren't resolved in the 24 days, then there's a kind of Scooter can correct me if I'm wrong about how to phrase this, but a process by which the complaint the IAEA still has is adjudicated by an additional process. And that, too, can take a very, very long time. So since the front end and the back end are indeterminate, one can, I think, one can't safely say exactly how long it would take, but it would be several months.
Well, the line that stood out for me in your op-ed, and it is a fine op-ed, I would commend, like John, to everybody. You had one sentence where it said, and I quote, "This stage has no time limit," which sort of says it all. So thank you for that detailed explanation. But really, it's that one sentence. This stage has no time limit. So, Scooter, here's what I want to know. Am I wrong in recollecting that the administration said they wanted anytime, anywhere inspections?
Well, I think Secretary Kerry may have said that you're wrong today, but that was, if you take back the clock, there were statements that they were going to get that type of inspection system. And instead what they have is a system that has multiple periods where the key point to remember is that lawfully under the agreement, without even violating the agreement, Iran can spend a great deal of time holding up inspectors after they have already given notice as to what they're interested in. Iran can hold them up, as I understand the agreement, lawfully under the agreement before anyone ever gets in.
Gentlemen, what I'm hearing, and I exaggerate only to make the point, is that it's possible for Iran, if it's challenged now, to delay the facts until January of 2017. Is that fair-minded, Hillel? January of 2017?
It's entirely possible, although, as Mary was saying, the problem is it's extremely indeterminate.
Right. It could be January of 2021.
2020, 2025.
Whatever administration you want to pick. Gentlemen, there's another piece of your op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that read to me like the first chapter of a thriller. I was hooked. I read a lot of ancient history called the Cold War, and the moment you mentioned President Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, I was hooked. Now, as I understand it, this is how I read it, because it's thrilling to close this op-ed. I begin with you, Hillel. You mentioned that the president, in his presentation of the Vienna Accords, mentioned Jack Kennedy. Why? How did that help him, and what could that mean?
Well, I think he was trying to suggest that, A, he was as tough as President Kennedy in confronting a situation in which there was a problem with nuclear weapons. I think that was what he meant to convey. I mean, it was atmospheric rather than anything precise. But I would defer to Scooter to say how that works with what we have here.
All right, Scooter, here's the way I interpreted your presentation in the Wall Street Journal. The mention of President Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, that brings to mind possibilities that are in front of us. What are they? Can you name one of them?
Well, it brings to mind some type of a secret agreement that President Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't want the American public to know about. So what could they be here? Well, there could be lots. One would be agreeing that whatever Iran agrees to on inspections will be enough. Whatever the terms are of the agreement, you could have something walking it back. You could also have terms, and the agreement hints at this, that the United States would be putting leverage on, for example, Israel, to stop them from doing something, or perhaps on other Arab states to stop them from forming some sort of a nuclear program. So it's only limited by the imagination of the Iranians to decide what they might have asked for, that under a Kennedy-like scenario, which the president invoked, they could be on the table somewhere along the line. Now, I have to remind you that the president and I don't go drinking as much as you might imagine.
Right.
So I can't say what was really in his mind, but invoking Kennedy, who only has these two very limited examples of successful negotiations, it raises two situations, neither of which is good.
Scooter, you served in a White House. Are these kinds of agreements done with a handshake, or are they written down?
Well, the Joint Comprehensive Plan is a plan. It's not really, in a way, an agreement. So that itself is an exception in the general arms control world. Bush, the senior, did something called the President's Nuclear Initiative 1 and 2, which were sort of what I'll call parallel play with the Soviets. The President said, okay, I'm going to take my tactical nuclear weapons off of ships. Why don't you bring your tactical nuclear weapons home? It wasn't a negotiated agreement. We just did it, and the Soviets followed, then the Russians followed suit. So it can be in many different ways. But when you're dealing with someone as hostile as Iran, you would like to think that everything is nailed down.
However, it's not, and I'll ask you both quickly, Hillel and Scooter, it's not outside of imagining that there was a promise made, similar to what President Kennedy promised Khrushchev. President Kennedy, in order to defuse the Cuban Missile Crisis, the blockade, nuclear weapons at hand. We know there were tactical nukes in the fields above Guantanamo Bay. It's all very scary. There were Soviet troops on Cuba. There was an invasion fleet possible. We believe that the president promised Khrushchev, if you pull your missiles out and defuse this, we will not invade Cuba. Hillel, I'll ask you, do you believe it's possible that the president made a scale promise like that to the supreme leader?
Well, I think there's a lot of language. It is possible, but what I would note that suggested in the agreement is that the whole tone of the agreement is tilted towards Iran. Iran has this right, it has that right. There's precious little to suggest what our rights are and what our concerns are, and that would easily suggest that the whole motion of the process and the agreement was to concede things to Iran as they asked for them, and to perhaps go further in some kind of other way.
Scooter, just 30 seconds. Is it possible that there was a promise made to the supreme leader not to attack Iran and to make sure no one else did, unnamed third country? Is that possible?
It is possible that he reached some type of side agreement. You have to remember, when we wrote this, the only thing being presented was that there was the JCPOA. That was all that was being presented. Since we wrote it, speculating that he was hinting at such side deals, we now understand there are side deals. And now the question is, well, what are they? And we don't know that yet. As far as I know, the Senate doesn't know yet.
Hillel Fradkin is director of the Center on Islam, Democracy, and the Future of the Muslim World at the Hudson Institute. Louis Scooter Libby is the senior vice president at the Hudson Institute. Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. I'm John Batchelor.